Welcome to the Deep Dive.
Thanks for having me.
Today we're diving into a really pivotal moment in global trade, the unfolding impact of the recent U.S. tariffs. You know those protectionist policies that President Trump implemented as of April 2025?
Right.
And you've shared some incredibly insightful material with us. Expert analysis, background on these tariffs, projections for how smaller economies will likely be affected, and even some potential strategies those economies might consider.
Yeah, there's a lot to unpack. It's a complex situation, that's for sure.
It is. Our goal in this deep dive is clear: to extract the most critical knowledge from these sources so we can truly grasp the implications of these policies, for smaller players on the world stage, and understand that toolkit of responses available to them. Okay, let's unpack this significant shift.
Yeah, let's. The material you've provided gives us a really detailed perspective on the potential shockwaves. And what's particularly insightful right from the start is that the challenges aren't just about the immediate tariffs themselves. There's a whole cascade of related effects that we need to consider.
Absolutely. So let's start by getting a clear picture of these tariffs. From what we've gathered, there's a foundational 10% tariff hitting imports from pretty much all countries.
That's the baseline, yeah. A 10% tariff on imports across the board. But it's more nuanced than that. Our sources detail how countries running a significant trade deficit with the U.S., those countries could face higher, what are termed reciprocal tariffs.
Reciprocal tariffs.
So a large trade deficit essentially means a country buys considerably more goods and services from another than it sells to them. The idea behind these reciprocal tariffs is to apply pressure, encouraging the other country to increase its purchases, thereby aiming to kind of rebalance that trade relationship.
Rebalance things, I see.
Exactly.
And then we see some specific cases carved out, like Mexico and Canada. They appear to be facing a much steeper 25% tariff. Although it's interesting that Canadian energy products have an exception, taxed at that original 10% level, where the source is clear on the rationale behind that carve-out.
They did mention it, yeah, likely reflecting the integrated nature of the North American energy market and the U.S.'s reliance on those supplies.
Makes sense.
But the general 25% tariffs on Mexico and Canada, those are significant increases, reflecting perhaps a stronger desire to reshape trade balances within North America. And of course, we can't overlook the situation with China.
Right.
The tariffs on Chinese imports have been ratcheted up again from 10 to 20% as of March 2025. So as you said, it's a multi-pronged strategy, applying varying degrees of pressure on different trading partners.
And the core justification for all of this, according to our sources, boils down to a couple of primary objectives. First, tackling that substantial $1.2 trillion trade deficit we saw in 2024. And second, providing a shield for American industries against international competition.
Those are the stated aims of the policy. However, the analysis we have also makes it clear that these moves have generated considerable apprehension worldwide. The potential for escalating trade disputes, genuine trade wars, and the destabilization of the well-established global trade order. These are major concerns being voiced by numerous economists and international organizations. This naturally leads to a crucial question for you to consider. How do these broad policy strokes specifically impact those smaller economies that are so intertwined with the global trading system?
That's the core of what we need to understand. What exactly makes a small economy particularly vulnerable in this new environment? Our sources define them as economies characterized by their openness and a very high degree of dependence on international trade.
Right.
Often with the total value of their trade exceeding 3 times their entire GDP, that paints a picture of deep reliance.
It does indeed. And this deep reliance creates several key vulnerabilities. The most immediate and direct impact is the increased cost of their exports when they enter the U.S. market. A 10% or certainly a 25% tariff can significantly diminish their ability to compete on price.
Right.
With both domestic U.S. producers and imports from countries facing lower or no tariffs. This directly translates to the potential for lower sales volumes, reduced revenue for their exporting businesses, and unfortunately, the very real risk of job losses within those sectors that are heavily geared towards exports.
And Singapore emerges as a really pertinent example here. Even with an existing free trade agreement with the U.S., they're still facing that baseline 10% tariff on many goods.
Right.
The sources specifically mentioned sectors like semiconductors and pharmaceuticals as being potentially affected. That's a stark illustration of how even seemingly well-positioned economies can feel the repercussions.
It is. And it highlights how interconnectedness, while a strength in open markets, becomes a vulnerability in a fractured global trade environment.
Exactly. And the impact isn't solely direct. The indirect effects can be equally, if not more, damaging in the long run. We're talking about potential disruptions to the intricate web of global supply chains.
Absolutely.
If major trading partners become embroiled in retaliatory tariff battles, and Canada's imposition of 25% tariffs on certain U.S. goods is a clear example of such a countermeasure, then small economies that are integral links in those larger supply chains will inevitably experience knock-on effects.
For sure.
A decrease in demand from those major partners, as they themselves grapple with tariffs, will also negatively impact the export prospects of smaller nations.
Yeah, you're absolutely right.
And then we have the added layer of currency fluctuations. Our sources describe the Singapore dollar's reaction to these policy shifts as mixed, which suggests a degree of instability and uncertainty in the financial markets as they try to digest these changes.
Exactly. Smaller economies often possess less leverage to manage these kinds of financial market reactions. And if we connect this to the bigger picture, the economic models, such as those from the Peterson Institute for International Economics highlighted in your sources, paint a concerning scenario. They suggest that after a few years under these kinds of policies, particularly if they lead to widespread retaliation, it's the small trade-dependent nations that could suffer the most significant economic setbacks, potentially seeing a noticeable drag on their GDP growth.
The Eurozone potentially seeing a 0.3 percentage point reduction in GDP growth over 2 years. That's a significant headwind.
It is. It really underscores the magnitude of the potential impact.
Now let's delve deeper into the Singapore case study. Given their exceptionally high trade dependence, it really stands out as a crucial example for us to examine.
Absolutely. With their total trade volume being 3 times the size of their GDP, Singapore's exposure to global trade dynamics is undeniable. And while the immediate direct impact of the U.S. tariffs on China, Canada, and Mexico might appear limited for Singapore, due to their existing trade deficit with the U.S. and their free trade agreement, but the Singaporean government is demonstrably not complacent about the situation.
No. The sources indicate a very proactive stance, particularly in monitoring those indirect ripple effects we discussed earlier. The potential for supply chain disruptions, the risk of higher prices for imported goods they rely on, and shifts in the overall pattern of global demand. These seem to be the primary concerns occupying their attention.
Precisely. The information you provided highlights how the Singaporean government is actively engaging with their business community to thoroughly understand their specific concerns, closely tracking any further announcements regarding tariffs from the U.S. and other nations, and constantly reassessing their own economic forecasts to maintain a clear understanding of the evolving global trade landscape.
And it's not just about observation. It seems they're implementing concrete support measures through Enterprise Singapore. These initiatives are focused on assisting businesses in diversifying their supply chains, exploring and accessing new markets beyond the U.S., and equipping them with crucial market intelligence to navigate this period of uncertainty.
That proactive approach is indeed key for small economies facing these challenges. And it's interesting to note the public statements from Singapore's Trade Minister, Gan Kim Yong. He expressed disappointment with the imposition of these tariffs and emphasized a preference for negotiation and dialogue over resorting to retaliatory measures. His concern about the potential for increased costs arising from countermeasures makes a great deal of sense for a small economy that thrives on relatively frictionless international trade.
On the other hand, we have the analysis from figures like Chua Hak Bin, who predicts a potential contraction in Singapore's manufacturing sector and overall exports. As a consequence of the deflationary pressures that could arise from these global trade tensions, that really brings home the tangible economic anxieties at play.
It does. And this leads us to consider the broader implications and the array of strategies that other small economies are contemplating. A recurring theme in our sources is the importance of diversifying trade partners.
Right.
The fundamental idea is to reduce an over-reliance on the U.S. market by actively cultivating and strengthening trade relationships with other regions, such as the European Union or the dynamic economies of the Asia-Pacific. The material even mentions smaller European economies exploring opportunities for increased trade with nations like China and Vietnam as a way to counterbalance potential losses in the U.S. market.
That makes intuitive sense. Avoiding a situation where your economic fortunes are too closely tied to a single player, especially when that player's trade policies are shifting.
Exactly.
And then there's this strategy of strengthening international partnerships. It appears that smaller nations might find greater negotiating power and collective security by working together on the global stage. The example of the European Union considering collective countermeasures is a powerful illustration of that principle.
Precisely. In unity, there is often greater strength, particularly when engaging in discussions or potential disputes with larger economic entities.
Right.
And looking beyond external strategies, there's a significant focus on bolstering internal economic resilience. This includes strengthening social safety nets to provide a cushion against potential job displacement or economic hardship, and actively fostering innovation within their own economies to enhance their adaptability in the face of these evolving global conditions. It's important to note that protectionist policies can, according to our sources, actually stifle labor productivity and exacerbate economic inequality, making these internal adjustments all the more critical.
It really underscores the complex set of choices these governments face. Do they opt for retaliatory measures, risking further escalation and potential harm to their own economies, as we've seen Canada do in a targeted way? Or do they prioritize negotiation and diplomatic engagement, as Singapore seems to be favoring? There's clearly no single, universally applicable answer for every small economy.
Not at all. The optimal approach is likely to be highly context-dependent, shaped by the specific economic structure, existing trade relationships, and political considerations unique to each small nation. And the IMF forecasts, even predicting a notable slowdown in EU growth based on relatively moderate tariff levels, really highlight the substantial economic stakes involved in these broad shifts in global trade policy.
So as we begin to synthesize all of this, what are the core takeaways that you see emerging? It seems quite clear that small economies are confronting a significant set of challenges as a direct result of these new U.S. policies.
Absolutely. They are navigating a complex environment characterized by both immediate direct impacts on their export competitiveness in the U.S. market and substantial indirect consequences stemming from the broader disruptions to established global trade patterns and supply chains. The sources consistently emphasize these dual challenges as the primary areas of concern.
And the principal strategies they seem to be exploring aren't just about weathering the immediate storm, but about actively reshaping their economic relationships and strengthening their internal foundations for the long term.
That's a concise summary. The key avenues being explored include actively diversifying their portfolio of trade partners to lessen their dependence on the U.S. market, forging stronger international alliances to enhance their collective negotiating power, and crucially, building up their own economic resilience through domestic measures such as fostering innovation and reinforcing social support systems.
Ultimately, it appears that the capacity of these smaller economies to adapt, with agility and strategic foresight to these rapidly shifting global trade dynamics, will be the deciding factor in their ability to sustain economic growth in what increasingly looks like a more protectionist global landscape.
Precisely. The resilience and strategic thinking of these nations will be rigorously tested in the coming years.
So, as we conclude this deep dive into a really significant area, here's a final thought for you to consider. What are the truly long-term ramifications of this apparent trend towards increased global protectionism on the fundamental interconnectedness of our world's economies? And are the strategies that we've discussed today genuinely sufficient to provide adequate insulation for small nations in what feels like an accelerating pace of geopolitical and economic change? What unforeseen vulnerabilities might yet emerge in the coming years as these policies continue to unfold and their effects ripple across the globe? It's a multifaceted picture, and the narrative is still very much in progress.
A lot to think about.
Thank you for joining us on the Deep Dive.
It's been a pleasure.